Okay, I need to speak on this. I'm going to say what I need to say. It's already my third time starting from the beginning, but third time is Emir Hashem, Chazaka, will have strength. So Emir Hashem, this is the first year of 55, because it's 55 weeks in a Jewish leap year. According to the Seder that the Friedrich Rebbe set up of dividing the Tanya to be learned every day, there's 1 day of the week is going to have a much longer Tanya. It's usually going to be a whole chapter. And in this year, in this Kvias, it's like it was in the original cycle that the Friedrich Rebbe was Kivea. That day of the week happens to be Shabbos. So I figured it's a good idea to go from Sunday to Sunday, because that way you're guaranteed to have a chapter break. You're never going to be stuck in the middle of a chapter. So anyhow, without further ado, here is the summary of Tanya for technically the last 8 days. Usually it'll be for the last 7 days. So in the beginning, on the first page, the cover page, the Alter Rebbe says a very important point to bear in mind, which is that the entire Tanya, I should say that it's referring Dafka to the first 2 books, which I'll get to that in shortly, Emir Hashem. So the entire Tanya is coming to explain how it says in the Pasuk, that the matter is very close to you in your mouth and in your heart to do it, which is to say to serve Hashem is close to us, or it's very close to us. And the Alter Rebbe says he wants to explain how it's very close to us. He says he wants to explain it in a way that's quite, in a sense, roundabout. There is an answer that could be given while standing on one foot, as they say, but at the same time, giving a slightly longer answer will yield quicker results. And Tanya is very much about practical results, Ma'aseh B'Peil, to be a practical guide more than just a philosophy. So then we get to the Haskamis, to the forwards, and in general you have a vibe that's given from the forwards, which is essentially that people were making copies of Tanya, and intentionally or unintentionally mistakes were creeping into the text, and so the publishers and the children of the Mechaber and the Mechaber himself and the people that gave their Haskamis, or Haskamis approbations, I think that's the word. So anyhow, so they all said essentially don't publish any Tanyas for the next 5 years without explicit permission from the publishers, and that is with the intention that there shouldn't be any mistakes. If you have 5 years worth of Tanyas going around, it'll be quite easy to check whatever version you have against a recognized Tanya. The Alter Rebbe notes in his approbation, or not in his approbation, in his forward, he notes that a person might think that it's very hard to get practical advice from a book, and rightly so. But the Alter Rebbe says that the advice he's giving is advice he's given over the years to many chassidim, many different situations, and he is able to guarantee, as only a Rebbe can, that everyone has the answer to their question in Tanya, and he urges and he pleads with the learned people in every community that if a person has a question, they should be able to, that they should take the time and put in the effort to help the person see their answer through Tanya, and he says that through them doing this, they'll also see the answer to their own questions in Tanya. And then they'll see the answers to their own questions through Tanya. Maybe they'll also see the answers to their questions learning in Tanya. Anyhow, something that the children of the Mechaber, of the author, noted in their introduction and in their forward, is that they included at the end of Tanya some other things that they felt were very relevant. They included a long letter that the Alter Rebbe wrote about Tshuva, explaining its concepts and its details, and they also included a bunch of miscellaneous letters, and they also included a Kunter Sacharin, an epilogue, if you will, of deep Kabbalistic concepts that the Alter Rebbe explains. And they said that the reason why they included these things, is because they all reference the book of Tanya very much. The book of Tanya is divided into 2 parts. You have the first one, which is Sefer Shel Beinonim, which is essentially explaining a guide for a Beinoni, which we'll get to that shortly, Emir Hashem. And the second part, Shari Yichud V'Emunah, explaining the concept of Yichud Hashem, which we know is a mitzvah, one of the first mitzvahs the Rambam lists. And what does this mean? How is it? What is it essentially? So the Alter Rebbe explains that in the second part. So you have essentially 5 parts. You have the book of Beinonim, you have the book about Yichud Hashem, you have the book about Tshuva, you have the book of miscellaneous letters, and you have the epilogue about deep Kabbalistic concepts. Okay, now to go into the first chapter of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe essentially proves, quoting various Gemaras, that there must be a concept of a Beinoni, where a person is able to be on as Beinoni would imply, some kind of intermediate level, and at the same time be so perfect that he or she, they don't do any Avera, even to the extent of Bittul Torah for a mere moment, is not even an Avera that they do. And Kal V'Chemer, not Kal V'Chemer, because the Derabanan is there, technically you could argue on a lower level, but that they also don't do any Yisr Derabanan, and that there's no one that they should be rebuking, that they're not rebuking. Essentially, someone that's perfect in all of their actions, and seemingly also in all of their thoughts. And yet, this person is termed the Beinoni. So, piling up many questions on that point, and then Alter Rebbe starts explaining, and he says that essentially there is a certain level of Beinoni, really, where a person is able to be on such a level where they're really not doing anything wrong, and yet they're not really a tzaddik. And in order to explain this, he says we need to give an introduction, and this introduction is gonna take a few chapters. But the introduction that we need to give is that Rav Chaim Vital, Talmud of the Arizal, writes based on our pasuk in the Navi, whose name is the same name as my father's name. He's sitting in the next room, so I don't know if I should be saying it. But essentially, it says in Neshamis Ani Asisi that I've created souls. So Rav Chaim Vital says every Jew has two souls. The Alter Rebbe says the first soul is the animalistic soul. The animalistic soul gives us our pleasures, it gives us our desires. He says even the desire that a Jew has to give tzedakah, it's a nature that we have. It's not that our desires are all inherently, towards klipa per se. It's that our desires are our desires, and either naturally in our nature we have that we want to give tzedakah. He says also the desire to be angry, which is definitely a negative character trait, as the Rambam writes in Hilchos Deis, and pleasure seeking and frivolity and laziness. These are also midas which come from the animalistic soul. These are all midas that Yidden have when they have an animalistic soul, and it's one of the souls that a Jew has. Goyim also have an animalistic soul. The animalistic soul of Goyim is usually on a much lower level. He says this explains what it says in the Gemara, that whenever a Goy does something good, they're really doing it for themselves. Essentially, that there's a certain kernel of selfishness in anything good that a Goy does. Rav Hillel of Harich, a Talmud of the Alter Rebbe, explains that this isn't referring to Chassidei Yom Ha'Olam. There's also opinions that a Ger Teshav, someone that accepts the Sheva Mitzvahs Fnei Neach, is different in a certain sense. But essentially, this is what the Alter Rebbe says, that even if a person could do very good things, again, the animalistic soul is not necessarily telling you to do bad things. Like for a Yid, he tells a Yid to give tzedakah. But the nature of an animalistic soul is to drive a person to desire, regardless of what that desire might be, whether it's eating chazer or if it's doing a favor for someone else. Then, in chapter 2, he says there's a second soul that Jews have. The second soul that Jews have is, he says, achelik ekami mal mamish, without the mamish word, it's a quote from Eiv, and he says that this is essentially that Hashem, in a certain sense, invested himself in us, in the same way that a father invests himself in his son, that the father cares very much, that as in what causes the birthing of the son is that you take a piece of the father, it's a very essential feeling that the father feels when he does the act. And then ultimately you have something else which is, it's technically separate, but it's a continuation of the father, and very often you could see a lot of the father in the son. So he says essentially this is what happens when you have a child, and the child comes from the father. Now, in a certain sense, we all know that children don't exactly look like their fathers in all respects. They don't 100% resemble their fathers in all respects. They have different DNA. So essentially, the Alter Rebbe says this is explained by the fact that the soul goes through different worlds in order to go from where it is, which is in the world of Atzilus. Tanya doesn't spend too much time focusing on those concepts, so I won't be explaining them more than necessary, because if I would, then this wouldn't just be a summary share, this would just be a Tanya share more in depth. And I'm going to try to keep this to under 11 minutes. I would say 10 minutes, but under 11 minutes, at least for this one. So the neshama goes from world to world, from realm to realm, and as it goes down, it becomes more enclosed, more invested in other things. If you would want to follow with the analogy of the child, you have the mother's DNA that gets mixed in. So as the soul gets more and more enclosed in the realms that it needs to traverse in order to get to this one, so the soul becomes more and more, in a sense, removed, at least in its looks and in its appearance and how it feels. It gets removed from resembling the Father more and more, resembling Hashem more and more. But yeah, it's still really like the Son of Hashem. So this soul is the second soul. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is, in a sense, an unchangeable kernel of godliness that exists within a Jew. Even though it could be buried, and even though it could be very grub, the Alter Rebbe notes the idea that parents, depending on how they act when they do the deed, as is explored very well in Kabbalah, it's explored also in Halacha, in Erech Chaim, and Siman Reish Mem, that as the parents conduct themselves when they're conceiving, that affects the child, and the Alter Rebbe ties this into the concept about how a neshama could be more refined or could be less refined, but it's not that the neshama itself is changing, but it's more what's covering over the neshama. Anyhow, this concludes the summary for the first week, including Yutas Kislev, and Amir Hashem. Next week, we will be discussing the following chapters.